Although the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza is still unknown, a strong theory contends that the ancient Egyptians moved large stone blocks effectively by using flotation techniques and water shafts. They might have accomplished this engineering wonder without the need for enormous ramps by using natural springs, canals, and water pressure. This narrative examines the creative approaches that might have enabled such an accomplishment. Much of what influenced his ideas and the subsequent formulation of his process was already clear and established when he began to theorize about the construction process involved in building the pyramids. There was already a 22-foot wide and 33-foot deep pyramid precinct. Evidence of a covered causeway and canal was found. The Greek historian Herodotus visited the Giza Plateau in Egypt in 450 BC, almost 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. Here, his guide told him that it took 10 years to make the causeway alone. However, Chris saw a pipe, a culvert that was far too well designed and sturdy for such a basic purpose, in contrast to traditional historians who see it as a ceremonial walkway. With these essential components in place, Chris began to develop his strategy. Installing all of the infrastructure would be the first step in the project. From the Nile, a canal would be excavated, linked to the limestone quarry, and located as near to the pyramid site as feasible. On the canal, a harbor would be constructed, and a covered causeway would connect it to where the pyramid would be built. The limestone outcrop would be surrounded by a precinct or moat that would be filled with water. Workers would be instructed to chip off any rocks from the water. The procedure would be repeated after the water level was lowered and all of the protruding stones had been removed. Only the first few meters inside the moat need to be leveled, not the entire space. For structural strength, the perimeter blocks must be exactly level. Similar to a house's outer walls, the interior is less significant, and removing rock and replacing it with blocks is rarely necessary. The foundations are leveled and prepared to accept the blocks after the water level has been lowered 30 millimeters around the entire pyramid base and no rock is sticking out. Quarrying and block shaping can start as soon as the project is underway and infrastructure is being installed. By the time the pyramid site is prepared to receive them, a huge number of blocks will have been finished. Limestone is a relatively soft rock when it is first quarried, but it hardens when exposed to atmospheric CO2. The blocks will remain softer and be easier to work with copper tools if they are immediately placed into the water after being released from the quarry phase. The water's surface can be used as a level surface by forming the blocks in the water. It was simple to turn the blocks in the water and level and shape all 6 sides by moving floats around them. Additionally, working in water is a more comfortable and cool setting. At the quarry, the outer casing blocks would be extracted upstream. During shaping, each block would be positioned into a precisely carved groove in the quarry floor. Every block inserted into the groove would create an identical angled face, which would line up precisely when positioned, thanks to the water surface being used as a level. A basic water level can be used to check the angle of the casing block. The quarrying process can happen at any time of the year. After being shaped, the blocks would be placed in a storage area on the quarry floor with floats attached. The floats should ideally be constructed from cedar wood. Limestone has a density of about 2.5 tons per cubic meter. A stone block can be floated with just 1.5 tons of buoyant material attached, because each cube displaces 1 ton of water when submerged in water. It would take about 3 cubic meters of cedar wood to float 1 cubic meter of limestone, because cedar wood has a density of about 500 kilograms per cubic meter. Either hollowing out the wood or adding more buoyant material in its place could drastically cut down on the amount of buoyancy needed. The boats would be constructed from silk papyrus matting wrapped around inflated animal skins, because Egypt, not unlike today, was not endowed with vast forests or an abundance of timber. The entire population knew how to work the abundant papyrus and used it to make everything from shoes to curtains. Because of its well-known buoyancy, papyrus has been used to create basic rafts for thousands of years. Liquids like wine and water were frequently stored in animal hides. They were excellent floats when inflated and when empty. It would save thousands of man-hours to load the multi-ton blocks on top of unstable rafts, because the floats would be pre-attached to the blocks and float in the water rather than on it. The Archimedes principle of displacement would mean that the blocks would need a lot less buoyant material to float in the water. Since any block floating low could simply have more buoyancy attached, no blocks will be lost to the river floor as a result of capsizing. If you think it's unlikely that a few tons of stone blocks could float, think about the oil tankers that are currently navigating the oceans, which weigh thousands of tons. Anything can float in terms of weight and size. Farmers would have made up the bulk of the workforce used to build the pyramids, and they would only have been available during the 3-month flood season when their fields were submerged and impassable. The Nile would rise, and the water in the quarry floor would get deeper when the flood season started. Blocks would float up in their thousands, ready to be transported. It would be possible to rope several blocks together and drag them up toward the harbor of Giza using either cattle on a towpath or men in crude reed boats. There is a covered causeway that runs from the harbor to the pyramid precinct. The causeway is filled with water from bottom to top, much like a water pipe. 2 gates are incorporated into the causeway at its base. The lower gate is level with the water in the harbor, while the upper gate is around 8 meters further up the causeway at a much higher level. Water is contained above when the higher gate is closed, sealing off the pipe. Next, the lower gate is opened. Since the upper gate is not subject to atmospheric pressure, the water will remain in place even though it is situated on a higher plane than the lower gate. When placed upside down in a sink filled with water, it will behave similarly to water in a glass pint pot, holding the water in place despite being above the sink's water level. A 25-foot-tall column of water is the equivalent of atmospheric air pressure. Blocks can be floated into the causeway when the bottom gate is open. The lower gate can be closed and the upper gate opened once the block gap between them is filled. The water pressure on the bottom gates will then cause the blocks to float upwards toward the precinct that is filled with water. To lessen this pressure, an additional set of gates will be constructed about halfway up the causeway. The flotation through the tube could be accelerated by passing an endless rope through the causeway's floor and the blocks that are attached. The moat would be partially filled with water once the precinct had been leveled. The blocks would drift into the water-filled precinct and up the causeway. The angled casing stones are the first blocks to be positioned. They would be lowered into place along a marked line after being floated around the precinct. To give a house its precise shape and strength, the perimeter brickwork is placed first. The majority of the interior walls are not load-bearing, and the roof rests on the perimeter brickwork. Whether it's a jigsaw or a house, the uniform shape is created by beginning and joining the pieces around the edges. After that, organizing the interior will be simple. The same is true for building pyramids. If the outer blocks are positioned precisely, the structure will have the proper shape. For the structure to have inherent strength, the first few layers behind the facing blocks would need to be carefully cut and joined together. Larger blocks can be positioned, providing a solid foundation for the building, because the lower blocks are not raised above the precinct height. Every block layer is positioned with its levelness against the water's surface, verified. After that, the blocks would be adjusted. More water is added to the precinct moat to make it deeper, so that the next layer can float into place after a layer has been finished and leveled. Until the water level reached the top of the precinct wall, which was about 8 meters high, this process would continue. The blocks must be raised above the precinct water level once the initial layers have been placed and are almost level with the precinct wall. A causeway-like structure could be replicated by constructing a lift shaft onto the pyramid's side. Once more, construct 2 distinct gates at the shaft's base, fill it with water, and then shut a second gate to keep the water inside. Go through the first gate and float through a lot of blocks. The blocks will then float to the top of the pyramid after the first gate is closed and the second gate is opened. Additional pairs of gates will be incorporated into the shaft approximately every 15 meters to maintain low water pressure on the lower gates. Blocks can be seen floating off the water lift shaft here. The waist side of a facing block, which already begins at the proper angle, would be utilized to produce a perfect seal during the construction of the water shaft. This is how the water shaft is being extended. When a layer of the pyramid is finished, the temporary wall is extended above it, and the last facing blocks are placed. A temporary structure will be constructed around and above the lift shaft to keep the water out, either in the form of mud and masonry walls or a wooden box. Here, a contemporary masonry wall serves as an illustration. Water floods the shaft after the top is extended with the mud bricks. It needs less reinforcement than the shaft because it contains less water. After that, each block required to build the subsequent level is floated off and put back in place until the layer is finished. Compared to the heightening, widening, and lengthening of the conventional ramp theory, the lift shaft system requires the shaft behind it to be less than a meter for each pyramid level rise, requiring comparatively less material and time to construct. To get around any problems with water pressure, the shaft wall could be as thick as 3 meters for each level rise of the pyramid. This would be followed by waterproofing the shaft. With the materials available at the time, there are numerous ways to accomplish this. These consist of bricks, bitumen, timber, or overlapping animal hides. The most likely solution is to use dried clay plaster to line the shaft, followed by bitumen or animal fats for waterproofing, as their Sumerian neighbors frequently do. A gully is constructed around the upper level's perimeter once a layer is finished. The gully's walls and floor are lined with mud, and the clay is baked dry by the intense Egyptian sun to make it waterproof. The gully can be filled with water after it is dried. To make small adjustments, levels can be taken once more, and additional mud can be applied to the gully floor. To connect to the gully, the lift shafts would be extended. Blocks can then be floated anywhere around the pyramid after going up the shaft and into the gully. Raising the multi-ton blocks hundreds of feet into the air is the most challenging aspect of building a pyramid, but the water shaft handles this task rather easily. The blocks could simply be dragged onto a wet mud floor or pulled on rollers once they reach the high level. However, it could be extended and used to float the blocks straight into place because water-filled gullies would already be present to check the structure for levelness. A lift shaft would be constructed on all 4 sides to expedite the erection process because of the massive number of blocks in the lower levels. A small wall is